Join me today for a non-fiction book review, American Nations by Colin Woodard. Welcome to the Geek Cabal channel. My name is Bob, and today we're going to be doing a non-fiction book review, American Nations by Colin Woodard. I picked this book up several years ago. I believe I saw the author either on The Daily Show, again, years and years ago. I believe Jon Stewart was still the host, or on C-SPAN, because at least at the time, I don't know if they still do, but C-SPAN had a weekend show where they covered books. And yeah, it was one of those two. The book sounded interesting, so I picked it up. And yeah, so here we are. And what the book is about, and I'm going to try to probably over here somewhere put the cover of the book because it'll kind of help explain this. But it explains how once European settlers began coming here to the U.S., how the people who initially settled each area had an effect on the character of the area, and that largely remains to this day. And he did note that, obviously the native peoples were already here, but because of the sheer number of Europeans that showed up, their culture just, overwhelmed them and now dominates. So that bit is discussed in the book, in case you're curious. It's been a while since I've read the book. I know the last chapter or two do kind of get into some political waters, trying to explain how the setup from centuries ago influences political opinion today of people in these various regions. And I thought that part was a little sketchy, as I recall. Plus, since I've read the book, there has definitely been an effort by various people to move to areas that they feel better represent them politically. And so I think that's going to skew things personally. But anyway, I just want to make that comment to tell you that, yeah, there is some political content here, but it's at the end of the book. Ignore it at your leisure. It's up to you. But the rest of the book is very interesting. It talks about, various groups, as I said, how they moved. And the part that I found particularly interesting being here in Indiana involved the Quakers, who initially settled, Pennsylvania and that area, but were somewhat driven out. And so they moved further west. And that is where they moved to Ohio, central Indiana, which is why I was interested, and I believe central Illinois. And that is why, at least to the best of my knowledge, people from this particular area of the country are considered to be somewhat even-tempered people. I know that the accent, such as it is, I can't really hear it because I live here, of this part of the country is what people try to emulate for being on like the news, so that sound more even-tempered and not from a particular part of the country. Because I'm sure if you've been around people from other parts of the country, if you're here in the Midwest, or if you're not here in the Midwest, obviously there are accents in other parts of the country. That's the way language works. Plus, there's still holdover from other languages from other parts of the country. So that was kind of interesting, because again, that's personal interest because I live here in Indiana. And all of the southern part, I believe, is more the folks who settle the Appalachian region, which those would be like Scott and Irish types, and how that talks about how that influences the area there now at the present. And it's just very interesting. I believe this is where I found out why Portland, no, not Portland. Yeah, why Portland Oregon is named Portland, Oregon, and why there's a Portland, Maine, and a Portland, Oregon. It's because the people who settled Portland, Oregon were from Portland, Maine, and couldn't decide on a name for the city, so they named it Portland after where they left. Which is like the lamest backstory ever, but I find it interesting. It's one of those weird little historical quirks. Um, but yeah, so if you want to know anything about this, and you can the thesis holds, but there's also several little just kind of humorous moments in the book. Like one chapter opens with, "If you're an American like me," and I'm paraphrasing, so I don't probably don't have his exact wording here. Like me, you've probably asked yourself at least once, why does Canada exist? Which I thought was hilarious. And, then it kind of goes into the why of why the U.S. has just never had that opportune moment to just be like, yeah, you're part of us now. Because, no offense to the Canadian viewers if there are any here, and not proposing warmongering by any stretch, but it would be a very brief, very one-way fight if there was any resistance at all. Oddly enough, there is I have to look this up to tell you exactly where it is, but I don't know if it's an amendment or if it's in the Constitution itself or if it's a law that was passed, but apparently if I've been informed correctly, I'm not a lawyer and definitely not a, U.S. legal scholar by any stretch, but if I've been informed correctly, we have such a deal where if Canada were to ask to join the United States, the answer is yes. Like apparently, like that's the beginning and end of the discussion. Like they're pre-approved. This does not apply to anyone else, but apparently it does to Canada. And I found that interesting, and I believe that's mentioned here in this book too. And I think it talks about the War of 1812 a little bit, if I recall correctly, and it talks about how various groups, ended up out west, how a lot of the West Coast was settled by people from the East Coast who left via ship and went around, whereas the interior of the West, okay, uh, if you go for like California, Washington, Oregon, apparently, because it's been, I don't know, 3 decades at least since I've been to California. So I don't know from personal experience. This is what people there tell me and what the book tells me. Once you go so far in from the coast, there's a very huge shift in the people because the coastal area was settled by people from the East Coast. So East Coast ideals and values and things like that are instilled in the coastal regions. The interior was settled by prospectors and miners and people from the plains and the south. And so it's a whole different makeup of people and traditions and ideas. And that's why you see like political divides between them, where typically speaking, the coastal region is more left leaning and the interior region is more right leaning in the three main Pacific coastal states. And so a lot of that has to do with who founded the areas and how things have continued since then. And yeah, it's and it also talks about Mexico and the groups of Spanish individuals who were already in the American Southwest whenever it was claimed by the United States, and how they've shaped the culture there, and how having a neighboring culture like Mexico impacts that, and likewise with the what we call the South, but it's really the Southeast, and parts of the southern coast before you reach Texas, the French influence, because there is heavily French dominated. New York City in particular, I think I don't remember if it has its own chapter, but it goes into detail on that, where the character of the city was tremendously established by the Dutch because they founded the city originally. And they're the ones who instilled the idea of, it's not so much that the city is welcoming to different people. It's that the city is less judgmental towards different people. The basic concept the Dutch had was, as long as you obey the laws and don't mess with other people, we don't really care what you do. It doesn't mean they endorse other things, but they don't condone them. When it comes to like ideas and religions and customs and things like that. And eventually the British took over because it was New Amsterdam. Then the British took it over, New York, named for the Duke of York. However, the character of the city had been established, I believe, for well over a century at that point. And so the British really couldn't do anything to reshape it. And it exists to this day, which is why New York is still a major cosmopolitan city with people from all over the world. And just, all kind of, it is the melting pot. And that goes back to the Dutch. And so that was a big example of how the foundations that are laid carry through to this day in several areas of the country. Now you do get some areas where a later, larger group would come in, and like the Pennsylvania. I don't remember offhand who kind of supplanted the Dutch there, but it does kind of cause a bit of a tonal shift in things and peoples in the area. But yeah, so if you want to know like a little dash of history about the United States, the various peoples that moved into areas, their languages, their customs, and how they've shaped how things are today, this is definitely the book for you. Also, for those of you who watch this channel for gaming reasons, this would probably be a good book to pick up if you want to understand how these things evolve in the real world, to try to implement them in your gaming world. If you created like a Dungeons and Dragons setting, to get an idea of how things change over time, how even though the peoples may change, the customs and the ideas don't a lot, because it just becomes entrenched. So even if, like again with New York, it's founded by the Dutch, so even though they're eventually supplanted by the English, and then, the next group and the next group and the next group, the idea stays because the next group is forced to adapt to the idea, and eventually it becomes a part of them, and it becomes a part of the institutions. The next group comes in. Well, the institutions stay, the ideas stay, and they're passed on to the next group as they assimilate. And even though you're talking different groups of people, several generations removed, from different continents entirely, with different backgrounds, the ideas kind of stick to a place, again, because of the institutions, the history. Because you'll always have people that are like, so what happened here 100 years ago? They read up on it like, oh, that's, pretty interesting. And they internalize that, and it becomes a part of them, even though they have everything else from wherever they're from originally. And so it's just, a lot of interesting ideas like that. Try to explain it there in the book. And like I said, from a historical perspective, I found it very interesting. From a D&D world build or whatever RPG world building perspective, definitely some things you'd want to keep in mind depending on like the scope of history you're going to try to account for. But yeah, I definitely recommend the book. Like I said, it's been a few years since I read it. I do remember going through it fairly quickly, so it's not a slow book by any stretch. Even though it's it's nonfiction, so slow and fast is kind of a relative thing. And then there are considerable notes in the back if you want the footnotes and where they come from, the quotes, things like that. There are, let's see, what is this? 328. Yeah, it looks like there's about 20 or 30 pages of notes here. So it is researched. It's not just, someone spinning tales here or anything. So anyway, if you guys like that kind of thing, check it out. I would like to say you could draw a connection between this and some of the stuff in the Strong Towns book I talked about, but this is more like broad, sweep of history kind of stuff, whereas Strong Towns is we came up with a really bad idea and then just ran with it. So kind of different. I'm sure that there are elements of this that probably impacted said decisions that Strong Towns is now criticizing. Uh, plus is the whole concept that everything's connected. So as you learn about one topic, you will by necessity learn more about other topics. And as you revisit other topics, you will now be armed with this knowledge over here. So, it helps to read. That's all there is to it, that does, gives you new ideas, internalizes things, new knowledge, So the more you read, the more you know, the more you'll understand other things, and yada, yada, yada. And now I'm beginning to sound like, probably like LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow here. But anyway, I hope you guys, find this interesting. I've got a few other nonfiction books I'm going to go with. A variety of topics because I read a bunch of stuff. Yeah, so keep an eye out for those. If you're interested in this book, there will be an Amazon affiliate link down at the bottom. If you want to order it that way, helps the channel. But otherwise, thank you folks for listening. Let me know what you think down there in the comments. Does this sound like an interesting book? Have you read this book before? Did you think it was interesting? Not interesting? Is there a better book on this topic? Anything like that? Let's get a discussion going down there. Start a little book club here. But hope you like BattleTech though if you're in the book club, because that's mainly what I review. But anyway, like, share, subscribe. I always like those fun things. But yeah. Otherwise, folks, thanks for listening, and keep on. I don't know. I got nothing here. Keep those pages turning.